say thank you very much. Obviously, I'm missing some of the floaters that are contributors here, but a lot of people have contributed and worked very hard over the last few days especially, but over the last few weeks and even months in some ways, trying to just work on our forward-facing, all of the different facilities and outward appearances and cleaning up. And there's windows, there's gardening, there's landscaping, there's bird nest removal, there's shrub removal, there's painting happening, there's scrubbing and bleaching, and these are just the things I can kind of remember, weeding and working the ground. So I just want to say thank you so much to everyone that's been a part of that, has been putting their hand to the plow, so to speak, almost literally in this case, and just trying to help uplift and mature and develop our presentation and our facility and our property here. So really appreciate all the hard work, really appreciate all the energy and effort that's being put forth to do that. It's been great. It's been great to see us gain ground and continue onward and upward. So anyways, every time we reach a new standard, we've now reached a new standard. So the goal is that we're constantly increasing that benchmark, and so we're continually getting better and improving, and we're continually increasing the standard of what we do and how we do it. So appreciate all of you contributing to that and making that go as well as it has been. So we have our 2-year anniversary celebration this Sunday. We've talked a little bit about that over the last few weeks, so I won't belabor it, but there is a sign-up sheet if you haven't already signed up to bring a dish, a side dish to pass. The main meal will be the barbecue chicken. You probably saw the cinder blocks out there for the cookout. We'll have a few other extracurriculars happening during the meeting, most notably of which we'll have Bob Martin and Pastor Apostle Chris Scarinzi, our apostolic covering and leadership. He'll be here ministering and joining us for the celebration as well. But yeah, looking forward to that. It's just been a complete joy the last 2 years for me personally, and I'm hoping for most of you as well, for whatever length of time you've been here. Hopefully you've enjoyed the ride so far. The good news is the ride is just beginning. There's so much more goodness, there's so much more ground, there's so much more kingdom activity before us. And to me, the beginning of the thing is not going to be greater than the latter parts of the thing. I don't want to call it the end of the thing because I don't plan on ending the church. But conceptually, you understand the thought at least. My intention, I believe the Lord's intention, is to continue to develop, mature, progress, advance, and there's a greater and greater expression and measure of the manifestation of Christ that we're aiming at. And all of this, even the natural stuff that we're doing, improving the grounds, improving the property, improving the building, cleaning things up, putting in central air, all of these kind of like natural things that, to me, they all serve a very real and legitimate purpose. They're enablers and facilitators. They allow us to become a more comfortable and clean and accessible place for people to be touched by God. And it also becomes a better witness and a better representation of the kingdom and of who God is and who Christ is. And by the way, it makes it more enjoyable for us as a church family to have a facility and grounds and property that is improving and getting better. So there's a lot of positives, a lot of wins that are attached to that effort. So I can't say enough of how much I appreciate everything you guys are doing. So with all that said, let's jump into the teaching tonight. We've been spending our last few Wednesdays in the book of Mark in chapter 13. This has been a portion of the book of Mark that I have in some ways been looking forward to. In other ways, I've been scratching my head saying, oh my, are we ready? Am I ready to go down some of these roads in a more public way? Because doctrinally, theologically, some of the ground that we're covering, I'm fully aware, is somewhat, if not drastically different than a lot of conventional mainstream theology concerning end times teaching that most of us have been exposed to through various church life experiences through the years. So anyways, we've been in Mark chapter 13. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time recapping the last 2 weeks, because if I do that, we'll never make any real progress. I'm already going, I'll say at a steady pace as it is. But just to give enough context for us to continue to bridge forward effectively, I will just remind us that this entire chapter, for the most part, is a response that Jesus is giving to his disciples based off of an interaction that they've had in the beginning of the chapter. So this is Jesus responding in the moment to a set of questions that the disciples had asked him in private. And the set of questions, basically, they sprung from this moment where they're walking by, they're leaving the temple area, and the disciples are admiring the glory, the greatness, the goodness, the architectural wonder that was the temple in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. And they're like, "Teacher, do you see this fabulous, wonderful, extravagant, awesome temple that we worship and we praise and we sacrifice unto God, and our priests perform their duties in this temple?" Like they were calling attention to this glorious thing in their mind. And Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left upon another." And then so the disciples then take him aside in private, as they often did when they didn't understand, or they couldn't really get their heads wrapped around what was stated. This is kind of like the pattern. Jesus would say something that made no sense to them, whether it was a parable or just an extremely, far out there statement, some proclamation that just didn't add up to their, in their Jewish theology, their Jewish mindset, whatever it might have been at that time, their Old Testament mindset. And so they're the "Teacher, when will this happen?" When will it happen? When will the temple, not one stone will be left on another, when will the temple be torn down and destroyed? And if you read the parallel accounts, you got to look at Luke chapter 21 and then Matthew 24, which says it even more clearly. The question becomes a three-part question. They say, when will this happen, the destruction of the temple, and what will be the sign of your arrival or your coming in power and political authority, and of the end of the age? So it's a three-parter. When is the temple going to be destroyed? What will be the sign of your arrival? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? So he begins to teach, and we've covered some of that ground already. Where we left it last week is we were exploring this one verse that came out in Mark chapter 13, in verse 10. And so he's talking about how they're going to be brought before governors and kings, and they're going to have to stand as witnesses before these political figures of authority, and they're going to be persecuted and tried, and they're going to be brought into the synagogues and beaten, and all this stuff's going to happen to them. Remember, the audience relevance. They asked him a question, and he gave them an answer that was applicable and pertinent and relevant to them. And I kind of made a little bit of a joke of it last week. Try to put yourself in the shoes. This is what we do. We tend to do. We fall into this trap. Try to put yourself into the shoes of the recipients of this response, and replay some of what Jesus says to them. You will be brought into the synagogues and beaten. It doesn't culturally, politically, it doesn't add up in our time, our setting, in our world. It doesn't. There's just no mathematics there. The reason why is because that message isn't for you. It was for them. And he was responding to their question. They will be brought to the synagogues and be beaten. But anyways, it all kind of makes sense. You have kings, governors, witnesses, persecution. All of that happened to the disciples. You read the book of Acts, and I quoted a dozen different scriptures from Acts that talk about them being persecuted, the early church, these disciples, first generation believers. And then you get to verse 10, and you're like, wait a minute, never mind. I was with you up until right now. And he says, and the gospel must first be preached to all nations. And then you start to say, well, I guess never mind. Forget about audience relevance, this doesn't work. And then you read in Matthew 24, and it says, actually, the gospel has to go out into the entire world, and then the end will come. Before the end will come, the gospel has to hit the entire world. And so we spent a lot of time last week talking about that passage. Most of our time last week was on that passage. And I'm not going to redo the whole thing, but I'll just give you the context if you missed it or if you don't remember fully. Basically, it does, once again, it comes down to audience relevance. And it comes down to their specific cultural and linguistic understanding of what that phraseology meant. And so I walked you through, I think, 4, 5, 6 scriptures. Missed one in Romans chapter 1. I couldn't find it at the time. It was 2 verses later. I was looking in Romans chapter 1, verse 6. It was actually verse 8. But in that case, I'll just quote it. Basically, he's like, look, this gospel is being preached in the whole world. And he says, he says that in Romans chapter 1, verse 8. Your faith is being proclaimed in the whole world. And so I walked you through 5 or 6 different passages in the New Testament that seem to be Paul and others talking about the gospel and faith and the message of the kingdom and the message of Christ hitting the whole world. And it doesn't make sense to our way of thinking. Is we're like, well, what about South America? What about North America? What about the rest of Europe and all the Africa? All these other, they were touching these areas, some of these areas, but some of them they weren't touching at all. Some of them they were just kind of scraping the surface of entire continents. And so for us, with our context and background, these scriptures don't seem to make sense. But you have to realize some of the wording here is specifically referring to, and Pastor Terry happened to mention this on Sunday, which I got a kick out of. Some of the wording here is very intentionally and specifically referring to the known inhabited world. And it was a word that they used in the Roman Empire, and it basically meant the whole of the known Roman world. And so I took you to a passage in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, and it talks about how a census was taken. And this census was taken in the whole world. Is the literal translation. Same exact word that they used in Matthew for where the gospel has to be preached in the whole world. But it doesn't mean cosmos, as Pastor Terry said. It doesn't mean the whole universal, everybody on the planet. It means the known inhabited Roman world. And so all of these passages that are talking about before the end can come, the gospel's got to hit all nations. The gospel's got to hit the whole world. All of them are referring to a specific thought, and that thought is, you've got to hit the whole known Roman world, which, by the way, is the whole known Jewish world. And I pointed out the reason why that was so important is because what was happening in this teaching is Jesus is closing the book on the Old Covenant age, the Old Testament age. That was part of the disciples' question. What will be the sign of the end of the age? And so he's answering that question. Well, before we can end the Jewish age, the Old Testament age, the Old Covenant age, first the gospel, the new covenant message, has to be preached to every Old Covenant person. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair for God to close out the Old Covenant age. So God's actually doing something very intentional and specific with this thought of the gospel hitting the known inhabited Roman world, because that was also the known inhabited Jewish world. And in order for God to close out the Old Covenant age, the Jewish age, he needed to first make sure the new covenant message fully was saturated and hit to that populace. So it was a very practical, very, God-like thing to do. That's the way God thinks. He's fair, he's just, he's reasonable. He was trying to make sure he's closing out this covenant in an effective and balanced way. So anyhow, let's go onward. Verse 11. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at that time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. I can belabor this if I wanted to, but I won't, because I want to keep moving and hit the more in-depth content that's right before us in a couple minutes here. I want to make sure we get to at least a certain point tonight before we wrap up. But yeah, I mean, you could page through the book of Acts. You could page through and watch, Paul before Felix. And you could watch the way these interactions would go with Stephen and his being stoned in, I think it's Acts chapter 9 or 8 or something, somewhere in that region, 8 or 9. And you can watch what ends up happening to some of these disciples and some of these early first-generation believers. And look, a lot of times it wasn't about them scripting or coming up with the right way of phrasing things in advance. It was, though, I'm on the ship right now, and God's giving me the wisdom right now as a prisoner on a ship and with a bunch of criminals, and I'm going to tell the captain of the ship what needs to happen so that we don't go under. Like, these are the types of moments that you kind of see. I'm referring to Paul when he gets shipwrecked in what is Malta. But anyways, there's all these moments throughout the book of Acts where they're brought before figures of authority and political figures and governors and kings. They're on trial. And God is working through them by His Spirit, giving them the response, the information, the strategy, the supernatural words of wisdom and knowledge that were required for that time for them to successfully navigate this high-intensity persecution that they were constantly facing. So that's what these passages are talking about. See last week's references to the book of Acts if you want to deep dive into that further. Verse 12, brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. So what is that talking about at a high level? So I'm sure we can come up with specific examples if we zoomed in if we really wanted to. But I don't think that's where the value is necessarily, at least for the purpose of this teaching. To me, what this thought is capturing, most importantly, most quintessentially, this is capturing the idea that, look, we're talking about the end of an age. We're talking about the end of an era. We're talking about the end of an entire system, a covenantal system, in which a set of people were relating to God for years. Years and, I think it's 1,500 years or something like that. Do I have that math right? Yeah, it's like 1,500 years. So you've got centuries and centuries, over a millennium of time that's passed here, and all of a sudden, this covenantal age is ending, and this gospel is being preached into the whole known world, and people are being told that you're no longer going to be saved because of your flesh and your adherence to the law and a sacrificial system with a temple as the centerpiece of this whole model, with a priesthood past operating all of the faculties and ceremonies and rituals that need to be a part of the system. You're no longer saved by any of those things because you're now saved simply and completely by having faith in Christ. And for that was such an amazing mind shift, like a just mind-boggling paradigm shift for it caused such a disruption. Like you had brother betraying brother, you had father and child, you had child rising up and rebelling against parents. This thing was like, and there's the family's message in there, but it wasn't that Jesus showed up to destroy families. That don't take it the wrong. The point is, he's saying, look, this stone, this pebble that just got thrown into the still waters, that ripple effect is going to create such a disruption and disturbance that it's going to upset the apple cart big time. And some people, Jesus is referred to as what? The stumbling stone. The stumbling stone. What does that mean? Well, it is a stone that one stumbles on. Right? And so there's a thought there about that. It says, look, this idea of shifting our entire mindset not towards works, but towards grace, via faith in Christ, who didn't set up this earthly kingdom that we thought he was going to, but instead set up this spiritual kingdom that we weren't expecting. This entire thought process was such a stumbling block, something that people would trip over, that were engrossed in this religious system. So if you were a Pharisee, and I don't care if you were But if you had the spirit of a Pharisee, that mindset, that attitude, that approach, that vantage point in the way you were living your life, you were going to stumble all over this. This was going to be a big tripping point for you. You couldn't get around this thing. In fact, you kind of hated this message. Huh. Don't even need to comment on that. Okay, so that's, to me, this is all about, the message, the gospel of Christ being that stumbling block. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. I think this is talking more about a literal, physical, earthly form of salvation. So don't get me wrong, they were saved spiritually by their faith in Christ. But I think this particular passage is talking about you'll be saved from the impending destruction that is about to befall Jerusalem and the Jewish people that reside in it. So this whole thing, once we get to the end, you'll see it more clearly, I think. But this whole teaching ends up being a set of warnings with specific signposts along the way to warn the early disciples whose generation shall not pass away until all these things have happened. That's later in the teaching. We've mentioned that already once before. This whole thing was a set of signposts and warnings so that they didn't get caught off guard and they didn't end up stuck in the walled city of Jerusalem, surrounded by armies, starving to death, while everyone's killing each other. And the streets are being bathed in blood. Literally. It's gross, right? Man, when we get to that point, I have to debate, there's even kids in the room. There's stuff from Josephus, you could read these accounts, and it'll make the hairs on the back of your head stand up straight. It's just sickening. It's insane, the level of tribulation and a terrible just massacre, starvation, mothers eating their baby, just insanity, just pure, the worst possible things that could happen in humanity were all just stirring and brewing in this terrible, terrible concoction of events with no escape. Once the walls were up and the armies surrounded that city, you were done. And it wasn't like, okay, the Roman Empire, the army showed up, and 3 days later, the city was destroyed. Bummer for all those people that died. It was like this prolonged, protracted, multiple-year awfulness, where they're burning each other's storehouses of grain, and there's factions that are warring within the walled city. We'll go into it more and more, but it was not the place that anyone would ever want to find themselves in. So this whole thing ends up being this warning, this set of signposts. It's Jesus saying, get out of there. And he gives it early on. The signposts are, don't worry, don't be alarmed, for the end is not yet. These are the beginning of birth pains. But he's ramping up, he's progressing through these signposts, and he's starting to give you signposts that now say stuff like, well, the end won't come until the gospel hits the whole known world. So until that happens, don't even worry about it. These are all just the beginning of birth pains. And he's about to ramp up to a more even prominent and potent sign. And so let's get there. And we're going to end here tonight on this last sign because it's one that's going to take a few minutes to really pick apart and do it justice. And to be honest, doing it justice is probably a subjective thing. We could literally spend hours talking about this one verse, but we won't because this isn't the forum for that. Verse 14, this is the big signpost. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And he goes on to let no one on the roof of his house go down or enter the house or take anything out, let no one in the field go back to those clothes. How dreadful it will be in those. This is the real deal sign. When you see the abomination of desolation, or that causes desolation, standing in the place that it doesn't belong, get out of Dodge. Get out of it. That was the message. If you're on the roof, get out of it. Don't go get your cloak. Don't go in the field. Don't just run to the mountains. And when you see the abomination of desolation, get out. And this is the big sign that he starts to point at. And he says, let the reader understand. I remember, this is an audience relevance moment that I get a kick out of now reflecting back. I remember as a very young Christian, the year one of my Christianity, I'm just plowing through the Bible, just like for the first time. Like, I've never even read this stuff. I didn't grow up in the church world, so like Book of Mark, Book of Matthew, this is stuff that like I've never been exposed to in any level of detail. Christmas scripture here, Easter scripture there, and those boxes were checked for the year, and that was pretty much it, if anything. So I'm reading, and I'm like, wow. This is so cool. It's like it's almost like we're watching a TV program, and it's like they're breaking the fourth wall. You ever hear that terminology where the TV program acknowledges that there's an audience out there, and it's like a self-aware TV or movie or any form of media. It could be a magazine, it could be a book, could be whatever, a novel. But they're breaking the fourth wall. They're coming out of the screen, and it's like they're acknowledging there's this real world out there. And I thought that this was happening. I thought Jesus was saying, yeah, let the reader, 2,000 years later, understand that you got to get out of here when you see the abomination that causes desolation. And that was my understanding at the time. Turns out I was mistaken. So if you put this up against the other passages, Luke 21, Matthew 24, they give you a little bit more detail, so it's easy to not fall into that trap that I fell into. He says, spoken of, written by the prophet Daniel. Let the reader of Daniel understand. And it turns out this reference to the abomination of desolation is a throwback, a callback to specific terminology that was used in the book of Daniel. So he's saying, look, let the reader of Daniel understand that this is the moment, the abomination of desolation that Daniel prophesied about. This is going to be it. And you want to get out of there. So what does that allow us to do? Well, it allows us to go into the book of Daniel and get more clues as to what the abomination of desolation was. So we're going to do that briefly tonight. And maybe at some point if there's question and answers, I don't know. I haven't figured out the forum how to do that right. We can pick apart more details. We're not going to get there tonight. So first and foremost, let's just start with the language itself before we get to Daniel. There's two main parts. There's the abomination, and then there's the desolation. So we'll start with desolation because that's kind of the easier one. If you were reading out of Matthew, and you were in Matthew 24, you'd have the same type of reference. It talks about the abomination of desolation. It talks about Daniel. It talks about this prophecy. This is a big sign. Get out of there. Flee Judea. Go in the mountains. All that. But if you're in Matthew, what naturally would have happened is you would have read Matthew 23, and then you would have read Matthew 24. Right? So right at the end of Matthew 23, do you know what Jesus says? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I've longed, as a hen would gather up her chicks under her wings. I long to gather you under my wings. But no, you didn't repent. You didn't listen to the message. You didn't receive the gospel. You didn't receive the kingdom. And now, your destruction is at hand. We'll just go there so we quote it correctly. I paraphrase it. I don't want to overstate. So let me make sure we get it exactly. Verse 37 of Matthew 23, you don't have to go there if you don't want to. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who send you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you are not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So okay, there's that word desolate. He's talking about how they didn't receive the message. They missed the boat. He wanted them to get it. He wanted them to, and he's like, no, your house is going to be left to you desolate. The word abomination is one that was familiar to the Jewish mind at that point, culturally, theologically. There's a couple examples we could use. We'll use an easy one just to get it out there. Ezekiel chapter 5. Somebody can beat me there, and I'll have you quote it. Oh, here we go. I'm going to make it. I'm trying to buy down the page turn time. Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 11. Yeah. The NIV continues to be a little bit of a crutch in some of this language because they'll pick different alternate words for certain translation. They'll kind of swap back and forth. So I'm going to have to help a little bit. But in Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 11, it says, "Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your vile images and detestable practices, I myself will withdraw my favor. I will not look on you with pity or spare you." So anyways, this reference to vile images and detestable practices, the Hebrew language there is what? Abomination. Does anybody else have an alternate translation that says abomination? Can we read that? Does anyone have it? I'll read my phone. You want to read out loud just so it's clear?
Just verse 11?
Yeah, yep. As long as you have a translation that's using the abomination word. Yep.
Yes, it's amplified. "Therefore, as I live, says the Lord God, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things and with all your abominations, therefore will I also diminish you and withdraw my eye, that it shall not spare you, and I also will have no pity."
Okay, so here's, I didn't necessarily do a fantastic job there, so let me try to clean up my mess a little bit. There's two words that matter. There's abomination and there's desolation, okay, in this whole sign. Desolation is a term that they were using that equated to destruction, okay? Abomination is a term that they're using that equates to idolatry and false worship, but specifically when it was done in what should have been a holy place. The temple, Jerusalem, wherever God was dwelling, tabernacle, whatever the moment in Old Testament history would have been. If there was false worship or false sacrifice or idol worship happening in a place where God was supposed to be revered and honored, that was called an abomination. So the abomination that causes desolation, there's something in there. There's some language in there. So you start to get a picture of, okay, there's a false worship in a holy place, and it's going to lead to destruction. And that's kind of the imagery that would be surrounding the Jewish thought process behind that phrase. Like I said, I'm trying to come into a landing on this verse without spending so much time that we don't get there. I could probably give you more examples of the abomination thing. I could probably give you more examples of the desolation thing, but I want to just keep moving. It's out there if you want to Google around and study it. It's not a big lift, a heavy lift to get there. Daniel chapter 9. Now the abomination of desolation is mentioned 3 times in the book of Daniel. Once in chapter 9, once in chapter 11, and once in chapter 12. I think for simplicity's sake, we're just going to go to one of them. Like I said, I want to get there. So in Daniel chapter 9, towards the end of the chapter, there's this whole timing prophecy that starts to unfold. And in this timing prophecy, there's a couple things that get kind of fence posts in there. Basically, the advent, the arrival of the Messiah, the Anointed One, is part of it. So when you remember, I'm not talking about second coming. I'm talking about first coming. There's a signpost in Daniel chapter 9 that talks about when the Messiah, the Anointed One, is going to show up for the first time. And so you can read through, and there's a whole history lesson there. And the way Daniel is inspired by the Holy Spirit to unravel this prophetic statement, he's using this system of sevens. And he doesn't quantify what a 7 is. He just calls them sevens. He doesn't give you a unit of measurement. He says, well, there's going to be 62 sevens, there's going to be 7 sevens, there's going to be X number of sevens, and you have to add them all and do the math. But you kind of have to, back out a little bit and say, well, what's a 7? Let's say it's a 7-year period. And then you can start doing the math of what would be 62 sevens? Well, what's 62 times 7? And you start to get a number of years. And he starts to give you these fence posts from the issuing of the decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem, and then, some Syrian Xerxes guy gave that decree at some BC year. And you can start to actually hone in on, wow, Jesus is going to show up and do his thing in what we now call the first century. And you can start looking at the math and the history. And today's not that day where we're going to go into all that math, because we'll never get there if we do that today. But I'm just trying to give you the context to say, okay, Daniel was giving us these sevens and these time frames. And so in the middle of this thing, in verse 26 of Daniel chapter 9, he says, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one, which is just another word for the Messiah, the Christ. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. When did that happen? When was Jesus cut off and had nothing? My God, why have you forsaken me? That's when he was on the cross. So this signpost was pointing to his crucifixion in this case. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, so he didn't give us a time statement of how far after the Messiah being cut off and having nothing that's going to happen. But he says sometime after the Messiah is crucified, this people, this other ruler, they're going to come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. Didn't give us the timetable for that part of it, though. So you're left to figure that out later. And you got to use other scriptures to do that. But anyways, let's keep reading. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. That means suddenly. War will continue until the end. This is parallel types of thoughts that Jesus went over in Matthew 13 and Matthew 24. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Oh, there's that word again. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on a wing of the temple, and who is he, by the way? This ruler of this people that's going to destroy the city. So in this case, it's a Roman ruler. But in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Okay, so I'm trying not to get lost in this and trying to just give you enough to put the pieces together and get a reasonable understanding. Here's what I'm hoping you'll land. The abomination that causes desolation has to do with, number 1, false worship in a holy place. Number 2, the destruction of something significant and important. And number 3, according to Daniel, it happens that it shows up after Jesus was crucified, but before this city was destroyed and the sanctuary was destroyed by this ruler and his people. Because this ruler is going to basically set up this abomination of desolation in that holy place. So we didn't get the exact timing, but we know what happened after the crucifixion. Okay, so now let's go back to the book of Mark. Actually, I'll do the figure. We're going to go to the book of Luke, chapter 21. Parallel account, same teaching, and we'll close here once we tie this up with a bow, hopefully. This is why it's so important to read, when you have parallel accounts that are all talking about the same thing, read them all. So many times the interpretation becomes much more clear, much more obvious when you put these things together. So I could have just taken us here without doing all that legwork, and we probably could have correctly interpreted this without even really going through the whole abomination, desolation, calculus through Daniel and through looking at what abominations are and what desolations mean. We could have just skipped a lot of that process, but I didn't feel like doing that. Sorry. Luke chapter 20. Well, I'm trying to give you an appreciation for depending on how far you want to go down into the depths here of the nuance of there's so much, I'll say, layering of what God's saying in his word. And the deeper you go with it, the more you're going to see the overlaying, and then it all starts to become this one mosaic picture of, okay, he said it this way from that angle, but then he said it that way from this angle, and you start to piece this thing together and you get a full and robust idea of what he was trying to articulate through the prophecies, through Jesus' response, through the scriptures, etc., etc. So anyways, Luke chapter 21, verse 20. Same exact sign, he just says it differently. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because it is. It's exactly what Jesus was saying. He's just, the quotation is emphasizing a different aspect of what he stated originally. This is how, you have three people tell the story in the same account. They're all in the same room. They all watch the same exact event. But the three people, even if they're telling an exactly accurate and correct and proper account of the event itself, they're going to emphasize different details. They're going to pull apart different specifics. They're going to bring out and illuminate different content, even if they're all accurately portraying the same account. That's exactly what you have in Luke, Mark, and Matthew. Matthew 24, Mark 14, Luke 21. So we're in the exact same portion of this teaching. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation, its destruction is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. That'll blow your theological mind. Let me read that again. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. Okay, so I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to try to explain this now through one more lens to hopefully wrap this thing up and put a bow. So we looked at it from Old Testament prophecy. We looked at it from Mark and Matthew and Luke, thinking, just the synoptic gospels. We looked at the different words, abomination, desolation, put it all together. We started to get a picture. Definitely this happened when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, and this was the big sign that said, get out of there, right now, flee to the mountains. So let me just look at the historical side of it. So in order for this to have made sense and have been fulfilled properly and fully at the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD, which is within one generation of Jesus' teaching. Remember, he says that later. All these things, this generation shall surely not pass until all these things are fulfilled. In order for that to make sense, we have to understand what happened. So the Roman Empire, they send not one army, but a set of armies. And they surround Jerusalem. So the way Rome was structured from a military standpoint, you had different area, we've got a base over here from this Roman conquered territory. That's one army. We've got another another army from this sector. And they sent a whole set of armies, and they kind of just encroached and surrounded Jerusalem quickly. So there wasn't a big reaction time. It was like you either saw the armies and got out, or you said, we're taking a stand, we're fighting. And you had a split decision moment, because they surround. And one of the things you have to know about Rome at this time, Caesar claimed divinity. You know what the soldiers would do as part of their daily routine? They would lie prostrate, worshiping Caesar as part of their daily ritual. Do you know what their ensigns, the main symbol that they had that they were carrying were these staves? And they have this metallic eagle that they worship. They worship the idol, the image of the eagle. And underneath this worshipped eagle thing, this brazen image of an eagle, there was also an image of Caesar that they worshipped. So what did they do? They showed up at Jerusalem, and I don't have the time to prove this as effectively beyond just quoting a part. Jerusalem was referred to as the Holy City multiple times, a bunch of times. Even when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness after he was baptized, the Spirit leads him in the wilderness. He hasn't eaten for 40 days ran. So the devil takes him to a high place over the holy city. What holy city? Jerusalem. And so what happened? The Roman Empire showed up with their idol images and their Caesar worship in the holy city, and they surrounded it. And they set up this abomination of desolation, destruction. And that moment, when the army started to surround, that was the last second, the last opportunity that anybody in the surrounding region had to either get in or get out. Because once you went in, the city was walled and they sealed it. And there was no way out. And instead of just trying to take the city, they're like, wow, this is a walled city, we can't penetrate it easily. It's actually less effort and excursion for us to just wait them out. We're just going to camp out here. And they're going to slowly kill themselves and starve. And that's how and then eventually they went in and burned the whole thing down. And just ripped every stone, they literally did rip every stone from them. But they didn't do that in a war, like a battle. They literally let them rip themselves apart and starve themselves out. And then they went in and just demolished what was left. And part of the destruction actually happened as a self-inflicted thing because, like I said, there's these disputing factions within the walled city. They're burning each other's buildings. They're taking each other's supplies. They're stealing from one another. They're killing each other. They're eating each other. Like, it was just cannibalism and insanity. So anyways, the abomination that causes desolation, eagle, Caesar, worship, Roman Empire, Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. Let's close there. That was exhausting. I don't know if it was exhausting for you, but I'm exhausted. Mr. Roger Wright, would you like to close it off?
I'm exhausted. Not from that, watching Brian work. A couple of things I was thinking of through that process. One, I'm thinking about modern day hurricane season, right? You see this every year. Some governor somewhere, some mayor, some city, or some the president or whoever will say, there's this tremendous hurricane coming, you need to get out now. Get out now. And you'll see droves of people leaving. And there's always that handful of, nope, I'm not going, I'm staying, I'm going to fight this thing, I'm going to tough this thing out. And then you watch the next day this amazing rescue of those people who tried to fight it and stay there and keep it out. Or I'm wearing a Hurricane Katrina shirt, I just realized that. There's some connection there. I don't know what that is. You're the connection person. Yeah, so anyway. But again, I don't know why I even said that. It just reminded me of that whole concept of there's this desolation of this hurricane that's coming in, and there's people that are going to heed it, and they're going to leave, and there's people that are going to stay there, and end up falling victim to it. But another thing, as you're going through this whole thing, and again, you kind of started this thing and said, it's going to be a paradigm shift for some people. To be honest with you, myself included in some aspects of it. The Bible is built line by line, word by word, letter by letter, precept by precept, right? And until you take each piece of it and you dissect it and you cross-reference it, which you're doing a great job of doing. I think I've said another time that I've been up front here that if somebody reads a particular verse during a service or something, I typically will be in my Bible and I'll read the one before and the one after. Because I really need to draw it into context to say, okay, that fits exactly what you're saying, or so it's just a habit I have or whatever. So I appreciate that you're going to Luke and you're going to Mark and you're going to here. I say all that to say this. I used to have this thing on my board in my office. Dave, you might have seen it if you ever walked in there. I had this thing that said, don't fear change, fear the lack of change. So think about that for a minute. Don't fear change, fear the lack of change. You serve an unchanging God. You as the servant of that unchanging God sometimes need to change.
That's true.
So the one in my office was a different point. It was for an industry to say, if you're willing to just stay the same and just plow down the road the way you've always done, and I have this mindset, and this is how my mom did it, this is how my dad did it, this is how my grandparents did it, this is how we did it, this is how this company works, this is how we do it. I guarantee if you go through life with that mindset of, I am not going to deviate or change from everything I've ever known, because this is who I am, this is how it is, you're going to find yourself floundering and trying to play catch-up. In a lot of cases, and again, from an industry perspective, that was the concept. Why am I saying that? If this is a paradigm shift for you, if you're struggling with some of these things, again, I'll encourage you to go in, again, on your own, line by line, precept by precept, letter by letter, research. You got this thing called the internet now. It really helps now. Well, kids, when I was a kid, you had to look things up in the encyclopedia.
What is that? What do you mean?
Exactly.
I got a set for you.
Anyway, I'm just saying, be open to what's being said. If it's messing with your paradigm and it's pressing a button against what you've ever known or ever thought, again, I just encourage you to be open to it. Where you're struggling with it, I encourage you between now and next week or whatever. Tim has been saying, be prepared as if you're the one going to be speaking. Go and look in and say, you know what, I looked into that, and this is what I found, right? This interpretation. And again, I would encourage you, if you're really struggling with something, have a conversation about it. Get more detail, get clarity on something that's really maybe stuck in your craw. Or I've said up here before, eat the meat, spit out the bones. If that bone's stuck in there, talk to somebody about it. Don't choke on it. Talk to somebody about it. So I just want to continue to do that. And Lord, I just continue to praise you for your word. I thank you for your word. Regardless of where we might be struggling with one aspect of it or another, whether we don't fully comprehend this piece of it and do that piece of it, the word is still truth. The word is still truth. The word is still a foundation that you can build on, you can live on, and you can find joy and happiness, and you can encourage other people with it, and you can impact in a positive way other people's lives with the word. Regardless whether you completely understand it, or whether you struggle with one aspect of it or another, the word is still truth, and the truth will set you free. So we thank you for your word tonight, Lord. We thank you for the detailed look at it. I think we all can grow from it and learn from it, and I, for one, am welcoming that in Jesus' name. Amen.
And I will say this too, just to keep myself accountable. I'll say half promise that I want to make. I'm creating, as we go, an outline of notes. I had started a couple years ago, never finished it. I kind of set my mind that I want to finish this outline as we go through Mark 13. I don't plan on widely distributing this or posting it on Facebook or like saying, hey, look at what United in Christ doctrine is. Let's throw darts at it for the rest of eternity. But if there's somebody here who's super interested in deep diving into some of the stuff or you missed the teaching, I will make the notes available to, on an individual basis just to help bridge those gaps, fill in those blanks. So come see me when we're done with Mark 13, and I'll be happy to give you the notes.